Thank you everyone for showing up. We appreciate your interest in energy or the free food, whichever it may be. But we want to, what the function of this conference is, one of the things I want to get across is, we're economists, professional economists, working in climate change issues, energy issues, and the narrative that a lot of the media puts out and coverage of policy debates about what the consensus is in terms of climate change issues does not actually accord with what's in the published economics peer-reviewed literature. And so that's part of what I want to make sure you guys walk away with today, and that's what I'm going to be covering in Ross and his talk as well, is just going over some of the standard results in the published economics literature about climate change issues, and I think you'll be surprised by what we show you. Let me just also mention that the PowerPoints that I'm going to be going over in Ross, there's some slides in there with a lot of information and graphs, and if you want us to provide those to you, just contact us and we'll provide them for you. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is the social cost of carbon, and again, I'm going to be just going over some things that are well established in this literature that economists practicing in this field know, but I think you'll see that some of these issues are pretty surprising given the way the public debate has been framed. Okay, so the social cost of carbon, what is it? I'm taking this from the White House's technical support document. So there was, in case you're not aware, there was a working group that the Obama administration established, and in 2010 they first published an estimate of the so-called social cost of carbon, and then they updated it in 2013. And so they define it as an estimate of the monetized damages associated with an incremental increase in carbon emissions in a given year. So just to step back for a minute, the big picture is there's computer models that show that there's damages from climate change, and of course those are driven by CO2 emissions, among other things. And so what the social cost of carbon is supposed to be conceptually is saying, okay, the computer says if you give off a ton of emissions today, what effect is that going to have down the road? And it actually runs through 2300 is what these particular simulations were calibrated for. And then in the computer simulation, it keeps track of the damages and sees how much additional climate change damages there are going to be from one more ton of emissions at whatever year we're talking about. And then they add up all those damages and then discount them to the present, and they come up with a dollar figure. So that's what the social cost of carbon is. Now, later on, I'm going to show you sometimes that process or that procedure spits out a negative number. So just keep in mind what that means if the social cost of carbon were to be negative, is that emitting a ton of emissions confers benefits on third parties. Okay, one last little caveat before we get into the details here. Just be careful when you're looking at this stuff. Sometimes people quote the social cost of carbon in terms of carbon dioxide, other times, though, in terms of carbon itself. And so one number, you just multiply it by a factor to convert from one to the other. So just be careful that you're looking at apples to apples when you're looking at various definitions and estimates. Okay, so to give you a frame of reference, the White House's recent estimate, the one that just came out in May, just to give you an idea of what they're talking about, they say in the year 2010, using a 3% discount rate, and later on in my remarks I'll explain why you have to specify the discount rate, that's really important. They're saying in 2010 it's $33 a ton, and then you see it rises over time. Okay, so that was the estimate as of May 2013. You might say, okay, well, what do these numbers mean? What are they going to be used for? Why do we care about this? Well, already the function of these estimates in the working group is to guide federal agencies in cost-benefit analysis of proposed regulatory actions. So, for example, they might argue, okay, well, the Keystone Pipeline, if that leads to increased emissions, how are we going to quantify the climate change impact of that? So they need to know, or some other, fuel economy standards, if they want to say, okay, this will reduce emissions a certain amount relative to the baseline if we didn't impose these new fuel economy standards. They want to be able to quantify and say, what are the costs and benefits of that? And so the social cost of carbon is used to say, well, we want to capture and monetize, quantify the alleged benefits because of the fact that there's lower emissions. So that's what it's being used for. In the economics literature itself, the social cost of carbon is very closely related to proposals to levy a carbon tax. So it's pretty close to, if you do it a certain way, that the so-called optimal carbon tax in terms of correcting the market economy and letting people take account of their emissions and the effect they're having on third parties. the social cost of carbon is the number that the proposals say should be used. Okay, so clearly this is a very important concept, and so now I just want to walk you guys through and show you these numbers, for example, the ones I just showed you in the White House's recent estimate, where these numbers are coming from, and I want to show you how malleable they are. Okay, so one way to put it is you might get the impression that the social cost of carbon is this very technical thing, that it's a feature of the world that's out there, and that the scientists in their white lab coats are measuring it, sort of like the radius of the moon or the charge on an electron. And what I want to tell you is it's not like that at all. That these numbers are driven, and understandably so, just because of the nature of what it is, they're driven by a lot of assumptions that go into these computer models, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. You can make the number high or low just by tweaking certain parameters. Okay, one thing though you need to understand as a backdrop to all this is that in several of these peer-reviewed economics of climate change literature studies of the effects of global warming, actually many studies show that for moderate levels of warming, up through 2 degrees Celsius or so, there's actually net benefits on the globe. And it's only with additional warming that then things turn negative. And you're going to need to understand that to see why later on some of those estimates of the social cost of carbon are negative, meaning carbon emissions, according to those studies, are a good thing in terms of helping the rest of humanity beyond the benefit of the person using the carbon. Okay, so again, this is just coming from peer-reviewed literature, just showing various estimates. So here in this region, these are benefits of global warming. You see it only later crosses below the 0 point for additional warming. Okay, so big picture, and then I'll show you, I'll substantiate these claims in a second, but let me just give you the big picture here. In the published literature, the estimates of the social cost of carbon, they're very uncertain. Okay, so they're all over the map, and that just underscores that this is not some objective number out there that we can all agree on the way scientists could agree, again, like on the radius of the moon or something like that. These are all over the map, and moreover, the estimates I'll show you in a minute have actually come down generally over the last few years. Furthermore, the peer-reviewed estimates, so estimates of this social cost of carbon that are in the peer-reviewed literature are much lower typically than the ones in the non-peer-reviewed literature. And that makes sense because there's less constraints if it's not going to be peer-reviewed, and so they can put in assumptions that are more divergent from what their peers are doing. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but let me just walk you through it because it's pretty important. So this comes from Richard Toll's survey of the literature. Each dot here represents a particular published study's estimate of the social cost of carbon. So this axis over here is the dollar figure. So you can see, in this x-axis here is the publication date. So you can see early on, back in the early 90s, here was a cluster of estimates. And now as time passes, you can see they get ever wider. See this one way up here? So as you can see, they're actually over time getting more sporadic. This right here, this dotted line, is Toll's sort of boundaries for the 90% confidence interval. So that's what I meant in the previous slide when I said the estimates are getting more uncertain over time. So it's not as if the economists out there are converging on this is what the social cost of carbon is. In fact, over time, the estimates are getting more open-ended. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is, look down here, there's a bunch of estimates below the 0 line. So that means it's in the region where there's a negative social cost of carbon, so that carbon confers net benefits. Okay, so again, this is being used to drive regulatory action because of the social cost of carbon, and they are spitting out numbers saying it's $33 a ton and so forth, when you can see in the actual peer-reviewed literature that it's the estimates are becoming more uncertain over time. In under several parameter choices, it's actually negative, meaning in the framework we're talking about, ironically, that would mean, oh, the government should be subsidizing CO2 emissions because it's conferring benefits on everybody. Okay, I mentioned in the peer-reviewed estimates, the average that Toll found in his survey was $22 a ton. If it's not peer-reviewed, the average of those studies of the estimate was $81 a ton. So again, you can see the big discrepancy. And that's why I'm mentioning this, because if you go out and you'll see some people commenting. For example, when the White House's May update came out, a lot of people who are very aggressively for a carbon tax were pointing to that and saying things like, well, they're moving in the right direction, but the real estimates, the people in the know think it could be as high as, and they'll throw out a very high figure, $180 a ton. And so I'm just explaining to you that, yes, there are estimates all over the map, but typically the ones that are extremely high are coming from non-peer-reviewed sources. Okay, let me mention, I got two more main points to make for you guys I want you to walk away with from my talk. There's two important issues. One is this issue of domestic versus global, and then we're going to come back to the choice of the discount rate. So right now, the domestic versus global, the issue is, and this is coming from the White House's working group study, they're explaining, again, they're giving guidance to federal agencies saying when you're running cost-benefit on proposed policies, these are the guidelines you're going to use to conduct those cost-benefit tests. And when it comes to the social cost of carbon, they deviated from two of those guidelines. So one thing is, they're quoting from OMB's guidance. Under OMB guidance, analysis of regulations from the domestic perspective is required. And then in the working group document, they say, however, and they go on to explain why they're not going to do that when it comes to the social cost of carbon. And this is significant because they themselves estimate that if you were to adjust the figures they give for the global social cost of carbon to convert that to say, well, yeah, but what's the cost of carbon domestically to the United States, you would have to multiply it, adjust it by a figure of 7 to 23%. So let me just show you what that would mean. This is what was reported in the media when the White House working group update came out in May. They were saying, oh, the social cost of carbon in 2010 is about $33 a ton according to this new estimate, and then it goes up over time like this. If they had followed OMB guidance and reported it in terms of the domestic impact, these are the numbers they would be publishing in that range, because multiplying these by 7% on the low end and 23% on the high end. So instead of saying it's $33 a ton, they could have said it's $2 a ton, possibly that low. So you can see the huge impact that has and why I think that they chose to do it in the global report, because that gives them a bigger number. All right, you can see how if they did it domestically, there wouldn't be much impetus for action. Okay, the final main point I want to bring up is that the discount rate is crucial. So let's step back a minute, make sure I don't lose you guys. Why is this so relevant? Because of this point right here. Remember, there's these computer models, and in the working group's calibrations, they ran through the year 2300. And in certain scenarios with certain emission trajectories, and if there's a high sensitivity of the Earth's climate to carbon dioxide emissions, that temperature rises quickly in certain choices of their parameters, there can be huge impacts on the global economy, that perhaps losing 25% of GDP centuries in the future in a worst case scenario. And so what's driving the estimates of today's social cost of carbon or in the near future, a lot of it is these embedded damages that are decades or even centuries in the future, but that are huge. And so if you understand how discounting works, well, if you want to convert a $1 billion loss 200 years from now into today's monetary terms, you need to know what interest rate do I use or what discount rate. So the higher the discount rate, it means the less significance you attribute to that distant event because you're discounting it more heavily. So that's why this number is so big when it comes to the climate change debate, because a lot of these damages are huge, but they're way in the future in these computer simulations. Okay, so again, the working group, and when it came up with its latest estimates, it deviated from what the OMB's guidance was. It said agencies traditionally employ discount rates of both 3% and 7% in accordance with particular circular. Right? So again, they're saying the standard rule was when you're reporting costs and benefits, do it at both a 3% rate and a 7% rate. And then they gave permission and said, if for some reason you want to use another rate, go ahead too, if you think that's warranted, whatever the context is, in addition to the 3% and the 7%. But they didn't do that when it came to this report of the social cost of carbon. And let me just show you how big of an impact that has. So this is again coming from the working group's May estimates update of the social cost of carbon. So this is typically the headline number that you saw in the media. These are the ones that they would have reported if you read a news story about the update probably. And what they picked there, that was at a 3% rate. Okay, so they're running all the computer simulations and discounting those future benefits and possible or benefits and damages at a 3% rate, and those are the numbers you get. They also reported it at a 2.5% and a 5% rate. So these far right columns here were what was in the working group's estimates, and just look at the impact it had. Just let's focus on 2010, for example. So they were saying at a 3% rate, the social cost of carbon is $33 a ton, meaning if EPA wants to impose a regulation that causes compliance costs to American businesses on the order of $33 a ton for every ton of carbon that they don't emit now because of the impact of the regulation, that could be justified because we're gaining that $33 in benefits using a 3% rate. If they use the 2.5% rate, the social cost of carbon for 2010 is $52, but if they used a 5% discount rate, they themselves are reporting it would only be 11. So just look at that. Just cutting the discount rate in half from 5% to 2.5 means what they're reporting as the social cost of carbon goes from $11 to $52. So this is partly what I mean, that you don't want to think about the social cost of carbon as some fact of nature out there that we just have to measure with ever more precision. I can more than quadruple the number just by tweaking the discount rate. So what I'm saying is, what would it be if they had followed OMB guidance and reported it at 7%? They can go ahead and report it at other rates too, that's fine, but this guidance said use a 3% and a 7%, and they just didn't report it. And my guess is we can't know exactly without getting into the models and running the simulations ourselves, but it would be close to zero, I would think, and conceivably even negative. And let me just show you why I say that. So again, this is something where if you want these slides, just email us and we'll give them to you, and you can look at this more carefully. This slide here I took from the working group's latest update, and it's just showing you graphically the impact of the discount rate. So up here, this is the legend. The blue is the 5%, the green is the 3%, and the red is the 2.5. So this is the probability distribution over the social cost of carbon, because they didn't just come up with a number, there's a distribution because it's uncertain. But you can see how when they up the discount rate, it all gets squished to the left. So down here, this is the social cost of carbon. So the more to the left it is, that means the lower the number. So you can see the huge impact of increasing the discount rate. It pushes it all up here, so it's piling up right around zero. And you can see even here, it's to the left of zero, these blue bars, and that's showing that in those fractions of the computer simulations, at a 5%, because this is 5%, the number it was spitting out was a social cost of carbon that was negative. So you can imagine, looking at this pattern, if they had said reported 7%, it would be over here. It'd be scrunched even further to the left. And so again, we don't know exactly what the number would be, but it would be much closer to zero and conceivably negative. And so that's, my suspicion is that's partly why they wouldn't want to report it at the 7% rate, because it would look awkward if the social cost of carbon is $52 a ton at 2.5%, but negative 13 cents or something at a 7% rate. So, okay. Okay, so last minute here, let me just give you the takeaway points. I know I covered a lot of material, so let me just make sure you didn't get lost there and you get the main points. So many studies predict that the net global damages from CO2 emissions won't even occur till the year 2055 or beyond. And I think that's at odds with, we hear stuff in the media about this, that, oh, it's happening right now and the impacts are already upon us. And, experts agree we need to take immediate action. The question is just how severe of the action. And I'm saying in the published literature, the net damages don't really start kicking in until decades in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that it's, a lot of it's baked into the cake, so don't misunderstand me. The authors of those studies aren't necessarily saying there's no problem, but the point is the narrative that's been pushed out there is not corresponding to what the economics literature says. As additional studies have been published over the last decade or so, the estimates of the social cost of carbon are getting more uncertain, meaning they're not narrowing in on an agreed upon number, that by changing assumptions, by trying different modeling approaches, it's getting more uncertain. So there's less consensus in that respect. But at the same time, they've typically come down. If you looked at the average of these published studies that the results are making it less pessimistic, that they're saying now, you know what, the impacts of climate change are not as bad as they might have thought 10 years ago. And then the last point is, if the administration working group, both in this 2010 initial estimate and then the 2013 update that just came out in May, if they had followed the two standard OMB guidelines that they themselves acknowledge are the guidelines in this context of reporting a domestic social cost of carbon, so doing cost benefit from the perspective of the U.S., and including the 7% discount rate as one of the values to report, then the official White House's estimate of the social cost of carbon would be virtually zero, I believe. We don't know for sure, but it would probably be close to zero or conceivably even negative. And again, what would that mean? It would mean using their own framework and their own economic models, they would have to say, oh, emitting CO2 is socially beneficial, so the government should subsidize it. Right, so again, what's my point here is that it's just showing you this term of the social cost of carbon gives this false sense of precision, this objective scientific thing out there, when it's driven largely by assumptions. You can make it very high, very low, conceivably even negative just by tweaking things plausibly. It's not that you have to make up some outrageous assumption. These are all plausible things. So if someone wants a high social cost of carbon, they can go get it. They can pick the people to run the models and have it come out that way. Okay, thanks for your attention, and we'll turn it back to Rob.